Can you tell me how you are today?
I'm doing good today.
That's good. Tuesday is another day into the week, right? If you haven't had a chance, I want you to go ahead and go over to this site. I wanted to spend some time today talking about the paper. I've received a few emails from people like asking me to look at their thesis statements and things like that. And so for the most part, people are on a good track. But I just wanted to answer any other questions about the paper that are lingering out there. I'm going to talk about it and go through the rubric a little bit today, but I thought that there might be some other things that you might be wondering. So you can go to that menti.com and put in the code, and then it will populate with the questions that you're interested in me talking about before we finish today. That way I can address anything that's popping up, anything that you're wondering about, if you need examples of things, etc. And so you can kind of do that throughout the period here if you want to. So if something comes up, you can put it there, and then that way, before we finish, I'll go to that site and answer anything that I haven't already touched on. And hopefully in that way, everybody can get what they need from today's class period. So let's also go over to the, wish there was a way to split the screen. There must be, right? To keep that Menti thing up there. At the same time, Dimitri, if you're just joining us, I put this up here. You might want to log into that. That way, if you have questions while I'm going over the paper, you can put them in there. And if I don't address them by the end of the period, I'm going to go through those questions. So, so that everybody's got their questions answered. I may touch on everything as I go through the paper generally, or I may not. So it just depends on what your questions are. So there's a code there. Maybe just leave a tab open with that, and that way you can add any questions that you might have. All right, so let's go to this week's module. Week 6 already, guys. Week 6. This is our last week of short fiction. So after this, we'll be moving on to poetry. Rather than give you a test on short fiction, instead there's going to be a little project to work on this week. I feel like as long as you can demonstrate your ability to analyze for short fiction elements, I think you'll be fine. So I made up a little project instead that will probably be less nerve-wracking than a test or something like that for you. So this week we'll be reviewing our short fiction terminology. We'll be finalizing our paper, which is due a week from this coming Saturday. Before we get to the content though, I do want to go through some updates. Hopefully you got my message on Google Classroom. I basically use Google Classroom for reminders and stuff in this dual class because STC wants us to use Blackboard so they can, I don't know, spy on us. But the hybrid extension is now to the 26th. The board had a meeting last week and they decided that we needed to delay a little bit because of all the hospitalizations in our area with the virus. So if you chose the hybrid option, then the earliest that you will go back will be the 26th. But yesterday at the faculty meeting, Dr. Gamboa said that they're working on the phase-in, which means most students who choose hybrid might not be coming back until almost Thanksgiving. There is an exception, and it's not going to hit any of you because you're here, but there are some students who don't have any internet, they don't have any device. They've been spending these first 5 weeks kind of without any school. So they are going to be opening up the school building. Hello, doggy. It's like a cloud. They are going to be opening up the school building starting this Wednesday, like tomorrow, for students who need to have a place to do their schoolwork because they don't have the equipment. They've identified about 75 students, but if you know somebody, if there's somebody in your family, if there's somebody in your neighborhood, your church, whatever, who hasn't been able to get on with their classes yet for whatever, technology reasons, tell them to call the school because the school is going to be setting up, and not just our school, but other schools in the district. They're going to be setting up computer labs so that those kids can be supervised and can go in and, try to catch up on their assignments, contact their teachers, and there's buses that are going to take them to school a couple times a week so that they can work on things. So if you know somebody, maybe let them know that they're trying to open up the schools just for those students who need it. And then everybody else who wants to do hybrid will be phasing in starting October 26th. Teacher, we get to be at home. You can tell I'm not in my classroom. We get to be at home or choose to go to school until the 21st of October now. So I don't know. I feel like this year is going to be like this all year. But that's just my impression. What else did I want to talk about? College fair. Somebody yesterday told me that it was yesterday. So hopefully you got my notification in Google Classroom last week that there was a college fair. I don't know for sure if it was this week. I can't register because I'm not a student. I don't have a student ID. But there's a college fair that East puts on every year. And usually it's in the gym if anybody went last year. But they have a bunch of different colleges there. Online, they were going to have 30 colleges. So I don't know if it's today, if it was yesterday, or when it is this week, but what I got, the notification that I had from the counselor was that it was this week. And if you go to Classroom, you'll see that I set it up. Where are we? Here we are. With all these reminders. So I try to keep these active and I try to delete the ones that are old. So, or I put something in the stream if it's something I'm just hearing about, because I feel like if you have notifications on, it pops up and lets you know. But you can check this site, and there's some directions here to see if it's passed or not, because they were telling me yesterday that it was yesterday, but I don't know if that's true. The counselors made me think that it was all week. So in any case, all our other reminders are here. I'll probably flip back and forth between them. Last update is for seniors. Just make sure that you're working on your Apply Texas. If you have questions about it, questions about your essay, remember that I did a seminar to help you through the essay, but also I've been looking at about 10 essays a day. So people in my AP classes and my independent study classes and my other dual classes have been sending me drafts to get feedback. It's not a grade, but obviously you want your essay to be the best that it can be. So if you want some feedback, if you want me to look at it for you, then I'd be glad to go through it and give you some ideas or reactions, that kind of thing. So that's up to you if you want to do that. But the counselors are expecting that you'll be pretty much finished with Apply Texas, including the essay, by the middle or the end of October. That's the best time to be finished because the FAFSA is coming online on Thursday. FAFSA is the financial aid. I put the link here to that. So it opens on October 1st, and that is where you sign up to get your financial aid and or get information that you need to fill out your applications for scholarships. A lot of scholarships will ask you to identify your estimated family contribution, EFC. And if you don't have that number, it's because you didn't do the FAFSA. So sometimes scholarships kind of depend on what FAFSA told you, if that makes sense. So it's good to do FAFSA ASAP. It's like a bank account. So they have so much in there for the year, and when they run out, nobody gets any more financial aid. So it's better to be the first one in line to get whatever you might have coming to you for financial aid. A lot of students get everything paid for. It just depends on your parents' income. But that one's opening up later in the week, so just FYI. Juniors, you can remember all that for next year. Juniors, you could be in my independent studies class next year, which is I walk you through everything week by week. All right, any questions on updates? Anything that's going on with school or any of that college stuff that you want me to talk about? If you joined us after I started, then you might want to open a tab and go to menti.com. You should be able to click on that and put in this code. I'm kind of leaving it open so that at the end of class today, if you have any questions about the paper that's due on the 10th, that's going to be a major grade for the semester. So I want to make sure that everybody does well on it. And so I'm going to talk about it and especially how it's going to be graded and some tools that will help you with it today. But if you have other questions while I'm going over things today, you can just start putting them in. It'll make like a workspace and the questions will start popping up. And so at the end of the period before I sign off, I'll go to them and see if there's anything that I haven't touched on and spend some time talking about them. That way you get all of your questions answered here in class. All right. Reminder to do today's formative. I was enjoying everybody's Friday formative from last week because people were making me laugh. I should do that more often because it was fun to grade them. I mean, it's always interesting to grade them, but it was fun to grade them because I didn't have to, you know, agonize over it. It was just like chuckling. I gave them points based on how hard I laughed. So if it was a good laugh, then it was a 5. If I just sort of chuckled, it was a 4. No, I'm kidding. I give everybody who did it a 5. We can have a break every once in a while, right? It's good. Yeah. No, you'd rather have the tough questions all the time. You cannot. It's all right. You cannot. Okay. All right. I see how it is. We still have some people joining us. All right, so I wanted to take a little bit of time to go over the critical lenses. You'll notice that I've been asking you some questions in the formatives about critical lenses because I want to make sure that you understand them. They're probably a new concept for you. They're not a hard concept, but I feel like they might be a new concept for you. So I do like to spend some time having you practice with them and go over them, especially since the paper that you're writing for the 10th depends on them. So I want to go over the 2 new ones from last week, the feminism or gender lens, and also the Marxist or economic lens. And I want to take a little bit of time to go back through the original 3. There are 5 total that we're going to study. There are many more lenses, but these are the 5 that we're going to spend time with. So I want to go over the other 3 also. That way, if there's any confusion, I think there's a little bit of confusion on the archetypal one. I noticed that in one of the formatives, so I want to talk on that a little bit. But let's go through those critical lenses from last week that we haven't talked about yet. And the first one, let me pin it here. There we go. The first one from your assignment last week is the feminist or the gender, wait, that's the lens, which obviously in really old literature, that was not anything that anybody thought about. That was something that, you know, wasn't a consideration because the genders didn't have any sort of equality or even the idea that there should be equality. And so we can go back to, you know, 15th, 16th century literature, 17th century, 18th century literature, and see things like the yellow wallpaper, where there's obviously a unequal relationship between men and women. So these lenses kind of came about in the mid 20th century. So now we see them in a different viewpoint. So with the feminist gender perspective, just an overview, this is where we look at that unequal quality between men and women, and we consider that when we look at a piece of literature. We have to remember that the time period was such that that was the norm, but we can look at how women tended to be oppressed, tended to be, considered not equal to men. And to be honest, that's the reason why we read a lot more male authors from the older time periods than we do female authors. There were female authors, but they didn't get published as frequently, and some even had to take on male pseudonyms, male names, in order to publish so that people would think that it was a man who had written that novel. So we talk about that. We also talk about alternative gender. I know it says feminist, but we kind of also talk about gender as well, like gender fluidity and the idea that alternative genders exist. And we don't put that on old literature, but we do consider it, especially with more modern literature. So then there's some questions down here. These questions, by the way, on each one of these slideshows are super important for your paper, because these will be the questions you can ask yourself when you choose one of the stories. You can ask yourself these questions about that story, and if it starts developing an interesting theory or an idea, then you might decide to use that perspective, that lens, for your essay if you haven't already chosen. So these questions, there are some more on the next page here, power structure with the patriarchy and so on. These questions can really help you develop a thesis and an idea for your paper. And these questions exist on each one of the slideshows. The way that they're all set up is so that first there's like an assumption. This is sort of like, this is what we think about with this lens. And then after that, a bunch of questions. So you'll kind of know if it's a good lens to use for your story if you start getting some real interesting, insightful answers to these questions. You'll know it's not a good lens to use if you can't really answer these questions, it doesn't work with that story, there's no real answer to that question, then don't try to write a paper about it, because not all lenses work with all stories. So, if you can start answering these questions for yourself and really delve into the deep aspects of the story, then I think that might be a lens to consider. So are there any questions about the feminist or gender perspective? I think the story we can see that the most with is the yellow wallpaper, and maybe also Story of an Hour, right? Obviously, the character Mrs. Mallard in that story feels free upon the death of her husband. Well, if you feel free upon the death of your husband, then there was probably some oppression going on and a power imbalance in that relationship, historically so. Nothing on that one? Okay. Let me move on to the Marxist, sometimes we call it the social or the economic perspective. So just like with the feminist lens, we can also look at a piece of literature through the societal or the power structure within society, and that usually has to do with money. So when we talk about that, we call it the Marxist, the societal, or sometimes the economic lens. So this lens says that people tend to make decisions based on economic factors. And I think that if you've been around, a decent amount, oh, here's somebody else's here. If you've been around a decent amount of time, you know that that's true. Obviously, you are going to make choices based on what you can afford. You're not going to, try to move out of your parents' house and into a mansion if you don't have any money. So there are certain choices that you, your family, people that you know make based on their economic situation. You're probably going to make choices about what college you attend based on economic factors. Can you afford it? With financial aid, with scholarships, with what your parents might contribute, whatever job you might have, that's how you're probably going to decide what, ultimately what college to attend. So there's that issue that people are driven by those financial economic factors. Along with the Marxist viewpoint, we also have the idea that the wealthy class exploits the working class, in the sense that they use them for labor, they try to pay the very least that they can for that labor, and then the wealthy class makes money off of that labor that they do not always share with the working class. That's why they're still in the working class. So this is another imbalance of power, right? The fact that somebody who owns a manufacturing plant might make more money off of that plant than the worker does is an imbalance in society. And Karl Marx, I don't know if you've ever read any Karl Marx in your history classes, but he's sort of like the father of communism, the idea, and communism in its essential meaning, not communism the way that it plays out in places like Russia and China, Cuba. So when we talk about the concept of communism, the idea is that everybody is equal, that there is no power imbalance because everybody makes the same amount of money, everybody has the same opportunities, and it's a theory. It doesn't work so well in practice, as we have seen in places like Russia and China and Cuba, and fascist Italy, places like that. So the reason it doesn't work, probably, is because of the human need to be superior and to gain more. And so there'll always be people who are trying to make more than these people. And so just human nature gets in the way. So this viewpoint says that people are driven by economic factors, which we know to be true, and also the fact that the wealthy class has an imbalance of power over the working class. So here are the questions that come up with that. And so when we look at a piece of literature, we look at the time period, we look at the location that the author was writing, what might have been happening historically in the economic landscape of that place and time. And we can ask these questions. So if you joined us just a few minutes ago, I've been trying to point out that on these slideshows for these 5 lenses, the critical assumptions are kind of like explaining the lens, and then the questions are meant to get you to analyze the piece of literature. So if you're reading one of your short stories for the paper that you're writing, you could ask a couple of these questions about your story, and if it starts to develop into an idea, if there's something there that you can grab onto, then maybe that turns into your thesis, and maybe that's the lens that you want to use. But if you look at these questions and they don't apply to the story, like I don't think the Marxism societal, well, maybe a little bit. I was going to say I don't think it applies to 56 to 0, but it kind of does, because he starts talking about his economic future and the fact that he sort of wasted his college years. So it could have enough of an element. I don't know if it would make 4 or 5 papers, but you kind of want to see how much does this lens apply to that story. And you can use these questions, and there's more on the next slide here, to just start to ask yourself about that story. Can I answer these questions? And that way I can maybe consider this as a lens to use with that story. Are there any questions about the Marxist or societal viewpoint? Probably that one's more complicated of the 5, because it relies on a whole other language of communism and economics and society-based elements. Okay, I want to touch and review on the other 3, because I know that you're probably, at this point, you probably already got a thesis statement or maybe a couple of them for the paper. And I want to make sure that if there are any questions, I'd hate to get your paper as a final draft. Maybe you don't take advantage of having me look at a draft for you. You turn in your final on the 10th and you didn't understand the lens, because that's going to be a failing paper. That's basically going to be a 0. So I want to make sure that if there are any questions about the lenses, that I can kind of clear them up. So with reader response, you have the slideshow there, but reader response is basically how do you as a reader respond to the text, like text to self type stuff. You can do that with pretty much any piece of literature, by the way. So reader response is kind of like the default. If you can't see any of the other lenses, reader response should work, because reader response is about how us as the readers, we combine with the intent of the author to create meaning. And so with the author putting it out there and us receiving it and thinking about it, we can create meaning. And then you determine what that meaning is because you're the reader. In other words, you're crafting it just as much as the author's crafting it, because you have to work in synergy like that. That's reader response. Archetypal is one that I asked about last week, and I started scoring, maybe I finished those. I started scoring some of the responses, the formatives, and a lot of times I was kind of clarifying for people about the archetypal viewpoint. So I do want to spend a few minutes on that, because I have a feeling that people just kind of wrote general answers and kind of danced around, didn't really talk about the archetypal part. And I think that might be because it's not solidified yet. So I want to spend a little bit more time talking about that. So the word archetype, you can see it in this word. It's a fancy word, but all it means is like a common element. An archetype is sort of like something that we see frequently. It's always popping up. It's something that we see in multiple different ways across the board. I think I asked on that one about archetype in Nightingale and the Rose. I think that was the formative. And some people just gave me summaries of the story, which is not archetypal at all. And I don't want you to do that on your paper. The other thing that I saw was that people were just talking about characters and not archetypal aspects of the characters. They would say, oh, well, this girl is selfish. True, the girl in that story is selfish, but how is that archetypal? So when we say something's archetypal, we say that it is a common element. So what is common in that story? Well, they're both young and they both act like they're very young. What do we see in young people? Sorry guys, but self-absorbed. It's a time in your life where you're supposed to be self-absorbed. Self-absorbed, oblivious to the sacrifices of others, materialistic, right? Melodramatic. That student is kind of like, oh, where am I going to get a rose? Does he do anything about it? Not really. He looks around, that's it. And then he just throws himself down on the ground and starts crying. So the qualities of those characters are archetypally young person archetypes. I'm not saying that y'all are like that 100%. I'm just saying that if we see those qualities, it's usually in a younger person. We don't usually see adults throwing themselves on the ground because they didn't get their way. We see tantrums like that in kids. So those characters are archetypal in their youth and the way that they are reacting to their situations. Even the girl is kind of like, oh, I know I promised you, but I found a better guy who's got something more to offer me. Bye, right? And so it's kind of like that fickle quality. And so when we talk about the archetypal lens, that's what we're talking about. In what way are these characters or this situation, in what way are those things something that we see commonly? So that's the archetypal. And again, if you are thinking about using that in your paper, then I would review these assumptions and I would ask myself about whatever story you're reading, these questions, and see, do they work with that story? If that makes sense. I feel like a lot of people probably didn't go back to the PowerPoint when they were trying to answer that formative question and just sort of guessed at what archetypal was because we're still processing what that means. But an archetype is just like a standard thing, if that makes sense. The last one, new historicism, that one is just about how we need to consider the historical aspects of a time period when we're reading. So if we're reading something from the Industrial Revolution, we need to understand the time period and what was happening within the environment at the time that the author was writing. So new historicism is just about how we can only look at a piece based on the time period in which it was written. We cannot take our 2020 mindset and put it onto something that was written 100 years ago or 50 years ago. If we're reading something that's modern, that's written recently, then new historicism doesn't really come into play. That's not a good lens to use on a modern piece because we live in the same time when the story is being written and taking place. So there's no difference in the historical influences of the time if it's a modern piece. But if it's an older piece, then there might be some considerations about what the author might have been living through, the norms of the time period for the people he was living around or she was living around. So that's where we take those things into consideration. Also, I think that number 3 is important on new historicism, the idea that when we look at literature, we see very often that even if it's a narrative, the author's trying to communicate something about morals, about values, about the way life is lived, and those have changed over time also. So the things that we value as humanity have shifted over time. So it's important to remember that also when we go back and look at pieces of literature. All right, so that's just a quick review of all 5 of those lenses. Is there anything about those lenses that you want me to touch on some more? Okay. Then let us talk about the paper because that goes along with the lenses. So if you click on the assignment sheet here, I want to go through that again with you. That way, maybe now you've started. Last week I gave kind of a light assignment load so that you could get started with your paper and take some time to really get going with it and touch base with me if you had questions, etc. So this week we'll be going back to the normal workload, but and next week too. But I wanted to make sure that I went over the paper with you today again, now that you've maybe started on it. So I do want to point out to you that there's information in your text and also example essays on these pages that are listed here. So if my PowerPoints and my explanations that I'm giving you are not clear, you can also go to the text and there are explanations in the text about those different lenses as well. And there are also some sample essays where the authors are using those lenses to analyze pieces of literature. Some of them you've read and some of them you haven't read. But you could kind of see how is it that the lens is applied to a piece of literature if you looked at some of those examples. And I listed them a little farther down on the assignment sheet if you looked at it. Story choices are here. These are the only choices that you have. I had somebody who sent me a thesis statement on a novel that they had read in some other class, and that's not what we're doing here. So you can choose from any of these stories that are listed here. Short fiction, these are your options. Don't spend your time looking for other stories. Okay, so make sure that when you start writing your paper, I don't know if you're at that point or not, maybe you already started drafting your essay, maybe you've already got your thesis statement and you're going with it. Just make sure that you remember to format your paper in MLA. There's a link here to help you with that. Will you get points off of your paper if you don't? Yes, it's on the rubric. There are people who fail on their first paper, unfortunately, because they don't pay attention to the qualities that the paper is supposed to have just in its organization. And maybe their content is okay, but they didn't proofread, they didn't write an MLA, they did whatever they want to. That's a failing paper. So I'm giving you the MLA guidelines. This is, you're not going to be citing anything except the story that you're referencing. So we're not talking about works cited or parenthetical citations. We're just talking about how do you do your margins, what do you do for your heading, what's it supposed to look like, and so it should look like this one here. One of the features that you'll see in a second on the scoring guide is, does it follow MLA formatting? And if you get a 0 on that, then that's severely going to affect your overall grade. I'm not going to fail you if you don't do MLA, but you're not going to make an A or B, probably. So just, you've probably done this before. So just follow the guidelines that are here. If you're nervous about it, then you can always remember until the 5th, which is next Monday, you can always share your paper with me and I will give you feedback free of charge. So if you are working on your paper ahead of time and you send it to me, then I'll point out you're not using MLA. You need to do your section heading correctly. Here's how you do it. I'll give you all that feedback. So if you're in that mode and you have a paper going on, you might want to just have it, run it by me. So this page here will explain to you how to double space, how to do your margins, how to do your title. You don't get to do that any way that you want to. So notice that the title here is not underlined, it's not in quotation marks. If you do that, it's wrong. If you forget your header up here, it's wrong. If you do the date differently than number, month, year, it's wrong. So just follow directions. I don't know how to explain that anymore. So that's MLA. You should do a works cited page, but the only thing that will be on it will be your story that you have worked with. So people were asking me, I don't think it was in this class, but I think it was in another class, about the length. So 4 to 5 pages means that you hit the bottom of page 4, the last line of page 4. If it's shorter than that, then it will not fulfill the length requirement. We do not count the works cited page in the page count for the essay. It's just the written part of the essay. So you need to be somewhere between the top of page 5 and the bottom of page 5, basically. I guess you could do the very last line of page 4 if you get exactly to that point. Thesis statement is important. I think I've talked about that, especially in light of choosing which lens you want to write about. And just a reminder that your ideas should be your own original thoughts. If you go and look up things, if you read the story and then you go look up things about your story that you've chosen, I want to warn you to make sure that you can separate your own thoughts from what you read. Number one, there's a bunch of bad ideas out there on the internet. But if you use it to help you understand the story, then you're putting yourself maybe at a disadvantage if you can't separate those things. So, sometimes people will read a story and they'll be like, oh, instead of taking the time to think about it, I'll just go read what a bunch of other people think about it. Well, that's their opinions, right? It's sort of like getting ready to vote for president and just hearing what everybody else is going to do and doing that. It doesn't show your own independent thought. So this paper should show your own independent thought about the story that you read. I'm not saying that you can't go and look at what's on the internet about whatever story you choose. I'm just saying you better be ready to separate that from what you write in your paper, because if it's too similar, that's plagiarism. So make sure that you are keeping it original. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, here's just a reminder that it doesn't like that there's a space there. Here's just a reminder that I will look at any draft. I'm not grading rough drafts in this class. We just turn in finals. So, but I will look at them for you ahead of time if you're planning ahead. I will not edit for you. I'm not going to fix all your comma mistakes. I'm not going to, capitalize things for you. That's something that you should have learned a long time ago. Or you should run your paper through Grammarly or something like that. Run the spell checker. I will probably tell you you've got a lot of comma mistakes, but then you're going to have to go back and fix them. What I'm going to comment on is, anything that's sticking out to me that would be something that would lose points on a final. I might look at a paragraph and make some suggestions on that paragraph for you. I might say that a section of your paper seems vague and you might want to be more specific. So I'll go through and I'll make comments on parts of your paper, but this is not a proofreading job that I'm doing. I'm not going to be fixing your errors, your grammatical errors. So that's something you're going to have to do on a program like Grammarly or, proofread on your own for that. So make sure that you do that. I'll probably point it out to you. There are a lot of errors in this paper, and what I mean is you better go back and fix them or it's not going to do well. So if you do want me to look at something between now and Monday, you can share that with me. My experience is that I get a couple around now and maybe through the weekend, and then I'll get maybe 5 or 6 on Monday. So it will take me a couple of days to look through them. Usually I get them back by Tuesday or Wednesday to everybody, and then everybody has until Saturday to complete it. So the reason I have a cutoff on that is because might take me a couple days depending on how many I get. I never know how many I'm going to get. And then your final is due a week from this Saturday on Blackboard. The assignment is right here, by the way. So if you scroll to the bottom on your week 6, then you'll see that there's a place right here where you can submit your paper, and you can look at the assignment page again if you need to right there. This one that we're going through right now. Just a reminder that there are only 2 papers in this class, and together they're worth 40% of your final grade. So in a way, this paper is 20% of your semester average. That's why I'm giving you plenty of time to work on it and walking you through the stages, giving you a lot of information on this sheet, offering to look at your draft for you, all of those things. So let's look at the rubric. I don't think we looked at this the other day or last week. So this is what I'll be using to score your paper. Obviously, you would want to be over here in the exceeds expectations section if you want to do well on the paper. So then what that means is that your paper should have these qualities. It should use MLA conventions flawlessly. Conventions just means rules. Structure of the essay enhances the reader's understanding of the message. You don't have an awkward shift, or the paragraphs don't seem to flow one into the other. Something's abrupt or something's in the wrong place. Also, no errors in grammar, and your thesis is complex but clear and then is supported in the paper. So those are the qualities of a good paper. And then the range here, 85 to 100, is about to what extent does it meet those requirements. So you could have, for example, a couple of errors with the MLA, but the structure of the essay is completely sound. So you could have a situation where the paper is in the meets expectations category for 1 or 2 elements and everything else is an exceeds expectations. So that's going to be more like an 85, 84, somewhere in between those two. It's like a hybrid of those two, if that makes sense. So not everybody's going to be in a straight category with everything in their assignment. So then obviously you don't want to be in the below expectations or the needs improvement section. If there's more than 10 errors in the paper, then that's hindering communication at that point. So double check with, Grammarly or whatever tool you use for. You can get Grammarly as a Chrome add-on, by the way. I use it right here. It's right here on my Chrome bar right there. And it will check while you're typing, so you can use that. Or I think is there a native spell checker or something on Google? So fix all of that. So these are the things that I'm looking for in the paper. So I think if you're going for a good score on the essay, that you will make sure that these elements over here are all taken care of. If you write your draft and you're not sure about something, like maybe you're not sure if your thesis is complex, well, that's the time to get it to me, right? And have me look at it and say, I think I'm doing okay. I'm not really worried about grammar, but I'm not sure if my thesis is complex enough. Well, then I will respond to that and I'll say, I think it's good. Or maybe you might add another element such as, and give you some feedback on that. So you can use the rubric to present your paper to me and say, I'm not so sure about the organization of my paper. Can you give me some feedback on that? Like sometimes people give me their paper and they're just like, give me feedback. Well, it's going to be whatever I see. And maybe if you want directed feedback, you could say something like, I'm not so sure about the MLA format. And then I'll go through and check it for you. All right, so that's how the scoring is going to happen. I put a lot of things on the last few pages here to help you, and you can use them or not, but I feel like if you don't use them, you're probably going to be further and farther away from my expectations on the paper. So I put in some thesis examples. I went over these last time. These are just some thesis statements that would produce a 4 to 5 page paper using some of the stories that we've already read and the lenses that we have been learning. You can also read examples of critical theory papers right in your textbook. So if you wanted to see what a reader response looks like, you can just go to page 1664 in your book and see how they set up this reader response, you know, little essay. It's not really an essay. It's more like a, like a paragraph response. Then there's a feminist one, there's a Marxist one, there's a new historicist one. So if you wanted to see right in your textbook how somebody would write using a lens looking at a piece of short fiction, that's where you could go to see that. I also put other literary analysis papers on here. These are not lens directed papers, critical theory papers, but if you just wanted to see how different people have set up analytical papers, maybe last year you just did a lot of rhetorical analysis. And so this is a different animal. You can look at them here. And then I put a whole bunch of things like how to write literary analysis, how to do the MLA, what if you're having trouble with your intro or your thesis. So there's little helps here. And then just a reminder about academic dishonesty. So make sure that you keep it with your own ideas. So obviously you've got a lot of help to prepare for this paper, and sort of on you to make sure that you have it done. Are there any questions on the assignment sheet or any of these examples or resources that are here to help you with the paper? Okay, let me jump over to Menti real quick because I'm going to change gears and talk about this week's assignment. Let me see if there are any questions over here. Nobody put any questions in? I like Menti because it's all anonymous. Nobody has any questions. All right, well, I'm guessing then that that means that y'all are on a good track and in a good place with your own essays, that you've selected a story, that you've selected a lens, and probably you already have a portion of your paper, your first draft written. So I'm assuming that you're already at that point. All right, and if you're not or you're having trouble with it, then just contact me and we'll see what we can do to help you out. All right. Okay. All right, so let's look at this week. This week we're wrapping up short fiction. So besides continuing to work on the paper that's due in a week and a half, I also want you to wrap up short fiction by using your terminology to review. I'm not going to give a test on short fiction. There will be short fiction on the semester exam, and that's later on toward the end. But I do want to make sure that we have a good grasp of the terminology. So your assignment for this week is to create an infographic that goes back to one of the stories that we studied this unit and analyzes that story for the basic literary elements. And so if you click on that, this one is due this Saturday. I don't know if you've done an infographic before, but an infographic is a design element that is for communicating ideas. So I put a link here so that you can see some and see the definition of infographic in case that you've seen them before, I'm sure. This Venage is a website where you can make an infographic if you want. But here's an infographic, right? So it's set up in a graphic format with sections, and there's information that is set up in a very accessible way. Obviously, you're not doing one on yawning. But you can see that there is a visual, which is the core of the infographic, and then the information is presented on that image or among those images in order to make sort of a dynamic presentation. So there's a bunch of them here that you can look at. Here's one on, I don't know, somebody's social media. So the organization of it is important, and you can choose how to set up your infographic. This site has a bunch of templates that you can customize and set up any way you want to. So that's an infographic. There are some other sites that I will share with you where you can get templates. But I want you to create an infographic that demonstrates your understanding of how short fiction elements work together in a short story. So I want you to choose one of the stories that we read in modules 1 through 5 for short fiction. I made a list of them a little bit later on down here. So these are the ones that you were assigned. You can choose any one of these. 1, 2, 3, 8 different options. And I want you to create an infographic that explains these elements of fiction. So these are all the ones that we studied, and I even included some details about them so that you could, start thinking about how those things get developed. And the checklist pages in the textbook, which I think are especially helpful for honing in on what you have to say about character or plot or setting, those things in the textbook. So you are going to choose one of the stories and then make an infographic that presents how these things work in that story. You'll be turning it in on Blackboard. It will be either an image file or a PDF. And you'll also be posting it on the class Padlet, which is here. I made a Padlet for you to present. Here's the assignment page in case you needed a copy of that when you're there. So you're just going to go here and then upload your infographic because I want your classmates to be able to see it. So you're kind of submitting it in 2 places, one on Blackboard so that I can grade it within the system, and then also on the Padlet so that your classmates can view it. So then there's a list of all of the things that need to be on your infographic about your story. Everything that's in bold here. Oh, plot's on here twice. Oh, I know what happened. I moved it. Fix it. Good thing I didn't make it into a PDF. So everything's listed here from the textbook, including page numbers and things like that that you can look at. And I even put some examples of infographics from literature. So here are some examples of what, they're not exactly on this assignment because I created this assignment, but you can go to, I don't know, did y'all read Julius Caesar when you were sophomores? The Shakespeare play? Maybe? Or freshman?
I think we did.
You think you did? He gets stabbed? Brutus?
No, I don't think so.
No? Okay. Well, in any case, maybe you read Animal Farm, or you don't have to have read the piece to be able to look at these examples. So these aren't examples of this assignment, but they're examples of literary infographics. And so you might look at this and go, oh, that's so fancy. I don't know, where am I going to make pigs? Obviously, you're not going to make pigs, but these templates that I have here in the resources are going to do all the hard work for you in terms of how the infographic looks. So there are tons of templates. I really like Canva. I use it a lot. So here are all of these templates that you can use. You just click on it. I like that one, right? I can say use this template, and it's going to put it in an interface where I can literally go in and change the colors. I can change the text. I can change the images. I can change everything. And then I can also download it up here in a PDF or a PNG or, like an image file. And then I can upload that to my assignment. So there are just a lot of ways that you can create your infographic once you have what you're going to say about these elements in bold. I think there are 7 of them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Once you have what you're going to say about them, then you go ahead and just sort of plug them into whichever infographic template seems like it would work. And there are tons of them. So you look for the one that has sections. You can add sections, take away sections, customize it. There's tons of them. That's why I like Canva, because they have a lot of really dynamic options. But there are 2 other options here. Maybe you could find something else that will help you make a infographic. Maybe you want to do it by hand if you're an artist. I don't know. But there are 2 other sites here, Vintage and Visme. I don't think they're as good and dynamic as Canva, but work with whatever makes sense to you. These are the stories. I already went over them. They're the same stories. You've already read all these stories, so it's not like you have to go and read a new story in order to complete the infographic. Just go to one of the stories that you've read. So this is taking the place of like a end of unit test, which I find difficult to do on virtual settings. So this one is going to kind of check to see, can you adequately explain character, plot, conflict setting, those things that happen in short fiction. The scoring guide is here. So this is how I'll be scoring it. Based on organization, topic, objects, accuracy, publication, and grammar. So just like any rubric, you want to be in the exceeds expectations category over here. Is there anything about this assignment that you want me to spend more time talking about? Okay. So that one's due this Saturday. And next Tuesday for class, we're going to be starting poetry. So there's a couple of pages in the book that I want you to take some notes on. I'll spend some time on Tuesday next week going over some of those preliminary poetry elements. There's just a few pages. There's a section called Defining Poetry and another one called Reading Poetry. So I think it's like maybe 5 pages total in those sections that I want you to start getting familiar with some of the terminology for poetry, because that is our next topic. All right, I feel like I went over everything that is on our module 6. So I'm gonna give you another opportunity. Let me go over here to the, nope, still no questions on the, about the paper. Okay, maybe I did a good job of explaining it. Okay. You still have the option, remember, until Monday to get some feedback and all of that good stuff. Are there any questions, or is there anything that I can touch on before I close the meeting?
I got nothing.
Okay, anybody else? All right, well, communicate with me if you have questions, and I hope you have a good week. Bye.